The morning of March 10th, 1906, began quietly in the coal basin of northern France. A gray mist clung to the rooftops of the villages around Lens, dampening the fields and muffling the sound of wagons on cobblestones. At the Courrières pit heads, those iron towers that marked the entrances to the underground world, men and boys gathered before dawn. They carried lunch tins, brass lamps, and tools worn smooth by years of labor. Some were still children, 11, 12, 13 years old, sent into the mines to haul wagons or tend pit ponies. Others were fathers who had spent their lives underground, lungs lined with coal dust, but hands steady and strong. Wives stood at doors, shawls around their shoulders, watching husbands and sons walk toward the shafts. Many offered the same parting words they had spoken 1,000 times before. Be careful. Come home safe. By 6 o'clock, cages rattled down into the depths, carrying more than 1,800 men and boys into the dark. Below, the tunnels stretched for miles, lit by flickering lamps and echoing with the clatter of picks, the rumble of carts, the snort of ponies. The air was heavy with dust, thick enough to sting the throat. Every miner knew the risks. Fire damp, the methane that seeped from seams, invisible until it ignited, coal dust that floated like powder and could explode in an instant. Accidents had happened before in Courrières, but management pressed production, and warnings were ignored. On that Saturday, the danger finally found its spark. Just after 7 o'clock, an explosion ripped through the galleries. A pressure wave of fire and gas raced faster than a man could run. Lamps blew out, bracings snapped like kindling, and air was sucked away in a choking roar. In some passages, the blast burned men alive, leaving only scorched timbers and blackened corpses. In others, it collapsed roofs, burying miners under tons of stone. Those farther away were thrown to the ground, stunned, ears ringing, lungs filling with soot. Pit ponies screamed and bolted until falling rock crushed them. On the surface, the ground trembled. Villagers saw smoke and debris belch from the shafts, followed by silence broken only by the cries of women running to the pit heads. They clutched shawls tight as they peered into the black smoke, calling the names of husbands and sons who could not answer. Children clung to their mothers, listening as bells began to toll. Rescue teams descended as quickly as they dared. They crawled through smoke so thick that lamps were swallowed by it, marking walls with chalk so they would not lose their way. Some staggered back within minutes, coughing blood, eyes swollen. Others pressed forward, pulling bodies into wagons, carrying unconscious men to the surface where wives collapsed beside them. But most passages were blocked by cave-ins. Beyond those walls of rubble, voices grew faint and then silent. By nightfall, hundreds of corpses lay in rows. Families pressed forward, lifting sheets, searching for boots, a belt buckle, a familiar scar. Coffins were hammered together in haste, funeral processions overlapping in grim succession. Entire streets fell silent except for the sound of weeping. In some villages, classrooms were half empty on Monday because the pupils had died in the mine alongside their fathers. The official toll reached at least 1,099 dead, though many believed more were lost. It was not only the number but the youth of the victims that stunned France. Boys no older than school children had perished underground, their small hands still clutching picks. Entire families vanished in an instant, fathers, sons, cousins, uncles, wiped out between one breath and the next. Grief hardened into rage. Strikes erupted across the coal basin. Tens of thousands marched with black banners demanding justice. Union leaders shouted that company officials had known of the risks, had ignored warnings about gas, had failed to water down the dust. Widows stood outside the company gates with children in their arms, screaming for answers. The government launched an inquiry, but to many, it seemed a performance staged to quiet unrest. The mining company insisted it had followed procedures. Families buried their dead with bitterness in their hearts. And yet, the disaster had one more chapter. Deep in the wrecked galleries, some miners had survived the blast. Trapped in darkness, they stumbled through debris, searching for air. They drank foul water from trickles on the walls, licked condensation from beams, chewed bark from timber supports. They whispered prayers, sang fragments of songs, tried to keep one another awake. Some gave in to despair, lying down to die. Others pressed on. Days blurred into nights until time itself lost meaning. Astonishingly, on March 30th, 20 days after the explosion, 13 men emerged from the mine. They were skeletal, bearded, their eyes sunken hollows. Carried to the surface, they blinked at the sunlight like men returned from the grave. Crowds wept and called it a miracle. But the miracle raised bitter questions. If men could survive for 3 weeks, how many others might have been saved if rescues had been more aggressive? Survivors said they had heard voices calling in the dark during the early days, voices that faded before help ever reached them. That knowledge tormented families who wondered if their loved ones had died waiting in vain. The Courrières disaster forced change. France passed new laws demanding stronger ventilation, better dust control, and organized rescue brigades. Across Europe, labor leaders used it as proof that industrial progress was built on workers' blood. But reforms came slowly, and in the coal villages of northern France, nothing could replace the lost. Widows wore black for decades. Children grew up in poverty, haunted by memories of that morning. On anniversaries, bells tolled and processions marched to cemeteries filled with row upon row of identical graves. More than a century later, Courrières is still remembered as Europe's worst mining disaster. Monuments mark the site, and plaques bear the names of the dead. But the true memorial lives in the stories passed down: the father who kissed his daughter goodbye and never returned, the boy who carried his lamp into darkness and was swallowed by it, the 13 men who crawled out of hell 20 days later, their survival both miracle and indictment. March 10th, 1906, began like any other day in the mines of northern France. By noon, it was history's deadliest day underground. The Courrières disaster reminds us that behind every statistic are lives cut short, families broken, and communities scarred forever. It is a story carved in coal dust, fire, and grief, a warning of what happens when safety is sacrificed to profit. Thank you for listening to Road to Ruins. Subscribe for more true stories where systems fail and people pay the price.